Okay, so we're going to take a look at scene six now, which is the moment in the play, I think, perhaps with the greatest level of optimism in terms of um, Blanche's fortunes, but particularly in terms of overcoming her alienation. You know, her alienation, which is such a integral part of the play's tragic elements of the plot. And also, I think one of the things that makes it so comparable with a birthday party is that sense of the protagonist's alienation. It's 2 a.m. on the same night. So there's this sense in which Mitch immediately kind of fills the void that's been left by this young man who Blanche has had this kind of romantic, sort of very brief romantic engagement with. Mise en scène in the opening, the outer wall of the building is visible, I think, provides this sense of perhaps the vulnerability that we see in Blanche's character, but also her being perhaps opened up to, for the first time, people that represent the forces that are kind of outside of her life, and that she's at this moment in time showing the first signs of being willing to embrace. The utter exhaustion which a neurasthenic personality can know is evident in Blanche's voice and manner. Mitch is stolid but depressed. So there's a sort of vaguely defined sense of emotional disturbance and fatigue, and I think it's something that actually comes from Williams' own perfect personal experience here. The neurasthenic personality, she's kind of, the metaphorical way of describing this would be that her nerves are frayed, but she's basically suffering from extreme anxiety. If we're thinking about this from a scientific perspective, Mitch is kind of sad, is stolid but depressed. So he's kind of engaging in this sort of forced sense of happiness. They've probably been out on the amusement park on Lake Pontchartrain, for Mitch is bearing upside down a plaster statuette of Mae West. So I think both experience the reverse of intended pleasure here, and I think the statuette is almost a kind of symbol for that, like, statuette that's upside down. They've tried to force themselves to enjoy themselves on this date, and it hasn't really worked well, I think, because they're not engaging in an authentic connection with each other through doing so. She opens the scene with saying, well, and then Mitch laughs uneasily. So he's, I think, uncertain in this kind of setup. And with the expectations of romance, Mitch is not someone who I think is extremely comfortable in this particular situation. and Mitch says, I guess it must be pretty late and you're tired. So he's already kind of making excuses for why their date might end. He says even the hot tamale man has deserted the street. So there's this sense of foreboding, I think, every time we hear about the tamale man or the Mexican flower seller. There's this sort of ominous signs of mortality. And he hangs on until the end. He's like a kind of grim reaper figure, I think. So Mitch and Blanche talk about ending their date further down. I'll walk over to Bourbon and catch an owl car. And she laughs grimly. Is that streetcar named Desire still grinding along the tracks at this hour? So I think there's a sort of irony involved in this mention of the title, because it's inappropriate to their situation at the moment in time, because their attraction lacks that kind of powerful animal magnetism that we see, between Stanley and Stella, and then even Stanley and Blanche, I think, later on in the play. And is actually driven by their shared sense of vulnerability. The vulnerability of characters in its relationship to love and romance or sexuality is an interesting point of comparison with the birthday party, where we see Lulu's, I think, being taken advantage of by Goldberg purely on the grounds of her kind of electoral vulnerability. There's this kind of disappointed feel about the end of this page. And she says, I spoiled it for you. He says, no, you didn't, but I felt all the time that I wasn't giving you much entertainment. And Blanche sort of blames it on herself here. I couldn't rise to the occasion, that was all. I don't think I've ever tried so hard to be gay and made such a dismal mess of it. So I think there's this sort of sense of Blanche as, again, as a kind of actress, of failing in a performance and her effort to do so. And I think that the lack of success in this moment in time, in this relationship, is the falsity that's based on their misattribution of their attraction and connection. As if they're going to be connected to each other in the same way that all the other characters in this play are. And of course, that appears not to be true. That's not actually the basis for their connection. And we'll find that out. This scene, I think, shows us that they can formulate a way of providing comfort and something along the lines of emotional authenticity for each other. But it's certainly not in the realms of this kind of animal passion that we see defining the relationship between Stanley and Stella. Mitch says, "Why did you try if you didn't feel like it, Blanche?" And she just said, "I was obeying the law of nature." So I think this seems to be, a moment of insight into the universality of desire, that there are these laws of nature, but she's trying to obey them consciously, and that's the key thing here. The key irony is that she's forcing herself to try and undergo an experience that isn't necessarily one that you can consciously control. Just a moment, my dog's eating my TV remote control. Gino, no. He's extremely bored. So, a little further down, Mitch says, "What law is that? The one that says the lady must entertain the gentleman or no dice." And here, I think there's, a misunderstanding of her need to be pleasing and adopting a subordinate role or position in this. In that, this shows us her sense of vulnerability in the way in which she constantly talks about needing to be attractive. And I think then she misunderstands what we mean by what she is sort of aware of in terms of this universal law of passion. It's not that she should be constantly adjusting herself in order to appeal to others. It's simply that, a universal sexual passion exists and drives the characters together. Mitch asks about the apartment and if it's the right one, and she says, "No, honey, that's the key to my trunk, which I must soon be packing." I think that's perhaps a sign of her willingness to be honest, that she should be packing away her costumes if we read it figuratively and symbolically. "I've outstayed my welcome, is this it?" And the music fades away, and I think, this is again another sign of, of authenticity and kind of tranquility in Blanche's mental state. She's talking fairly frankly here, and it's not often in the play that she gets the opportunity to do so. And I think that's why the destruction of this connection between the two characters is such an element of the tragedy of the plot, because, they offer themselves, as we'll see as we go through this, a potential the potential possibility for redemption, and that, I think, is, that's a huge element of what's sad about the play, is that that's lost. That's lost massively by the destructive way in which Stanley tries to confront them. So she says, "Honey, you open the door while I take a last look at the sky." And she leans on the porch rail and opens the door and stands awkwardly between her. "I'm looking for the Pleiades, the seven sisters, but these girls are not out tonight." "Oh, yes, they are. There they are. God bless them all in a bunch going home from their little bridge party. You get the door open, good boy." So she's looking here, I think, for a sense of belonging, and it's not actually present in the action that's going on here. And I think this offers an interesting contrast to the way that the sky is used as a symbol in Desire Under the Elms, because it's this sense often of transcending these forces that seem to be compelling and driving the lives of these characters in ways that they're unable to understand and unable to control. And again, here, I think this is a sign of her desire for some form of evasive escapism. And there's this awkward flirtation between the two of them. Mitch says, "Can I kiss you good night?" And she is unhappy because he says, "Why do you always ask me if you may? I don't know whether you want me to or not. Why should you be so doubtful here?" And I think this shows such a strong contrast between Mitch and Stanley, that, okay, the desire that's compelling them to is very conscious and very awkward, and it's almost like he here is attempting to simply just fulfill the stereotype of what a male romancer ought to be. The agency resides with him entirely, and that's where he's so uncertain. It's a role that he's not comfortable in, so he immediately asks questions which contrast him with the forceful sort of agency that Stanley displays in his, eventual rape of Blanche. So they talk about kissing in a previous moment, and Blanche down here, I think, shows us her vulnerability, because she talks about actually refusing Mitch's sort of sexual advances on a previous occasion. She says, "I was somewhat flattered that you desired me. So again, there's this sense of not necessarily that she desires him, but that she's pleased because she can sense his desire for her, which is a slightly different thing. And she says, honey, you know as well as I do that a single girl, a girl alone in the world, has got to keep a hold on her emotions or she'll be lost. So there's this huge sense of vulnerability in her declaration. But she's already shown to us that I think that she can't do this to keep hold of her emotions or be lost. And so there's this sense in which I think, sadly, she is able to do this with Mitch, and that's what ultimately, I think, brings up questions about the intensity of their romantic connection. And Mitch just sounds solemn here in response to this, and he says lost. And there's this sort of anxiety about her desire for control. And Blanche says, I guess you're used to girls that like to be lost, the kind that get lost immediately on the first date. And obviously she's talking about, submitting to sexual urges. But we know that she's not very good at controlling that. So the irony here to the audience is that we're aware that Mitch is not really fulfilling that component of their attractiveness, that component of attractiveness to her. And then Mitch, in a moment of genuine sincerity, says, I like you to be exactly the way that you are, because in all my experience, I've never known anyone like you. Now, I think this is a moment of genuine sincerity from him to her. But of course, again, the irony is that much of what she has communicated to him about her identity and her mannerisms and her supposed, moral codes here that she's sort of articulating of not putting out basically on the first date, lots of that is performative and inauthentic. So the sad irony of this is that Mitch thinks he's being sincere and he sincerely is attracted to the version of Blanche that he sees, but that version is inauthentic itself. And she looks at him gravely, I think, because she's so conscious of this. She's so conscious of the fact that this is an inauthentic version of her, and then bursts into laughter and claps a hand round her mouth. So I think it's her lack of authenticity that prevents her from valuing his sincerity here. And I think that's very comparable to Stanley and Meg and Goldberg, particularly in the birthday party, that lack of insincerity. And personal or integrity that means that she ultimately fails to strike up a human connection in the play. And Mitch is rightly upset by this. Are you laughing at me? No, honey, the Lord and Lady of the house have not yet returned, so come in, we'll have a nightcap. Let's leave the lights off, shall we? So again, there's this desire for, the light to be seen as symbolic, that motif of light and dark that's so deeply connected to the ability of Blanche to confront reality. And I think keeping the lights off maybe shows us that, I think it provides the basis for her eventual confession and authenticity that she communicates with Mitch here, that she can't quite tolerate doing so with the light of reality, but that Mitch represents this kind of dark, safe space for her to actually be an authentic human being. And Mitch just says, you just do what you want to. And I think his tolerance there is very much like Petey's with Meg in the birthday party. She precedes him into the kitchen. The outer wall of the building disappears and the interiors of the two rooms can be dimly seen. So the mise-en-scène here offers a sense of comfort and stability, that vulnerability to the external that's characterized in the opening stage directions through that the way that Williams handles lighting. Here disappears and creates this sense of enclosed comfort and stability, I think. Well, enclosed and comfort because Stanley's not there. She remains in the first room and she speaks to Midge, and then he asks her if she wants a drink, and obviously we know that she always wants one. And she says, I want you to have a drink. So there's a sort of reversal of her usual actions here. She's I think, perhaps spotted in Mitch that he's a kind of fellow evader of reality, and perhaps ultimately wants him to be less self-conscious in his pursuit of her. She lights a candle further down in these lines, and I think that is in order to cultivate that appropriate amount of the motif of light for her to be authentic with him, and creates the opportunity for a further illusion, I think. Blanche says, we're going to be very bohemian. We're going to pretend that we are sitting in the little artist's cafe on the left bank. So again, it's it's aestheticization of reality that she's ultimately conjuring in order to have this connection with him, and that's her ultimate problem, is that there is no real behind this. And so again, she's conjuring a very deliberately aestheticized vision of reality. She's talking as if they're kind of Hemingway and Fitzgerald in Paris in the 1920s. And so this, again, equates artistry with self-deception that I think obviously invites comparisons with Stanley's Piano Stories and The Birthday Party. And then she starts speaking French. And of course, this only serves to further create a sense of distance between the two characters. And you see that through the language contrast here, where she speaks French, and Mitch very heavily replies, "No, no, I." And then she flirtatiously, asks him to go to bed with her here. But importantly, in these lines, they're comparable to all the stories that characters tell themselves, I think, in The Birthday Party. Because there's this sense of willful self-delusion in Blanche's character that ultimately is the reason for her failure to strike up a real connection with Mitch here. She's trying desperately to fabricate another space in which she can be performative and illusory. She said, "I found some liquor, just enough for 2 shots without any dividends, honey." So again, drinking goes hand in hand with self-deception in Blanche's life. And again, I think that invites comparison with the way that alcohol is handled in the party scene at The Birthday Party. Mitch heavily says that's good. She enters the bedroom with the drinks and the candle. And Blanche says, "Sit down, why don't you take off your coat and loosen your collar?" I think this direction from her prompts him to relinquish his fears, and shows us the sense that their connection is based on an evasion of reality for both of them. Because Mitch then says, "I'm ashamed of the way I perspire," and this dialogue here, I think, ends up taking the tone of a kind of mutual confession, and that Mitch is the one now that's forced into the position of having to make some kind of confession about his own vulnerability. She says, "Perspiration is healthy. If people didn't perspire, they would die in 5 minutes. This is a nice coat. What kind of material is it?" They call that stuff alpaca. It's very lightweight alpaca. I don't like to wear a wash coat in summer because I sweat through it. So here, I think Mitch almost takes the lead, I think, in confessing to his vulnerabilities and opening himself up as an authentic human being to her, and shows that his uncertainty and vulnerability is actually the means by which they could offer some kind of solace and redemption to one another. And then he talks about being heavy build, and Blanche says, "You're not too heavy, you don't think I am, you're not the delicate type, you have a massive bone structure and an imposing physique here." And I think there's this sort of mutual desire for reassurance and an actual moment of rare sincerity from Blanche, because she is herself so vulnerable about the way that she appears and her attractiveness. And so this is where we start to see a kind of productive, authentic, emotional connection being formulated between them. Mitch then talks about the membership to a gym that he was given by a friend. It was the finest present I was ever given, and he talks about working out and then asking her to punch his belly. So I think here there's this desire here to present his physicality in tandem with his vulnerability. I think he understands that he's presented something quite vulnerable about himself, and makes, I think, a last-ditch attempt to seem sort of archetypally masculine in front of her, and to seem sort of virile and sexual in his nature. But of course, that's not really the basis for their possible emotional connection. In the following dialogue, his dialogue in these lines, I think, mirrors her sort of earlier concerns. And so there's a sense of comfort again in their mutual vulnerability, because we see as we go through these lines, she says, "Guess how much I weigh, Blanche." And then they talk about their appearance. He says, "I weigh 207 pounds and I'm 6'1.5" tall in my bare feet without shoes on, and that is what I weigh stripped. Oh my goodness me, it's awe-inspiring. My weight's not a very interesting subject to talk about. What's yours? And this from a kind of, imagine this being one of my friends, and I kind of think this is the worst sort of flirtatiousness that we've ever seen. But of course, in the play itself, it signifies that they do have the possibility and the potential for an authentic connection by virtue of their vulnerability. And I think, there's a sort of interesting comparison with Stanley and Lulu here, because they have that sort of sense of potential connection. But of course, in Pinter's world, there is only the possibility of dominating one another. And so therefore, that connection is never possible, because it would be on the basis of a shared sense of subordination in terms of relative power. And so there's this sort of cringy physicality where Mitch displays his prowess and raises her off the ground, and he talks about her appearance. He lowers her but keeps his hand on her waist, so there's this sort of tentative desire to persist in the physical contact with her. And she speaks with an affectation of demureness. You may release me now. And Mitch just says, "Huh?" I said, "Unhand me, sir." And so there's this huge sense of the socioeconomic gulf between the two, which is a reason for their distance and alienation from each other. So we have this constant sort of fumbling awkwardness from Williams in this scene, where Mitch and Blanche have this potential for connection, but many things keep getting in the way of her. This fumbling embrace of her, and her voice sounding gently reproving, I think it connects to both of that, the possibility for their romance, the fumbling embrace, but also the things that are likely to mess it up. And she, again, resorts to this sort of feigned chivalry when she says, "Just because Stanley and Stella aren't home, there's no reason why you shouldn't behave like a gentleman." And Mitch just says, "Just give me a slap whenever I step out of bounds." And she knows that ultimately this is not natural to him, this sort of forced sense of male sort of aggressive sexuality. And she says, "You're a natural gentleman, one of the very few left in the world. I don't want you to think I'm a severe old schoolmate teachers or anything like that. I'm just, and pretends that she has old-fashioned ideals." So there are so many different layers of uncertainty going along in this moment in time. Mitch is being forced to adopt a slightly more aggressive, archetypally kind of alpha male sexual persona here than he is comfortable with naturally. And Blanche is pretending to be significantly more kind of prudish than she really is. And so we have, again, that the sad irony of the situation is that if they were to just be their vulnerable selves without any of this sense of falsity, they would then provide the solace for each other that they're ultimately looking for, and the escape from the sort of aggressive competition that everyone else's relationship seems to be based on. And so she says, "I guess it's just that I have old-fashioned ideals." She rolls her eyes, knowing that he can't see it of her face. And I think there's a sense of her being tired of her own act here, because I think she sees there's possibly no need for it with Mitch. And I think that's the story here is their fumbling failure to just strike up that authentic connection in the opening of the scene. There's a considerable silence between them that I think is a combination of both sexual tension and also the sense of the fact that they're not engaging on the level that's real. They know that both of them. Blanche sighs and Mitch coughs self-consciously. So both of them are uncertain in this context, and I think aware of the distance between the two of them. And so they strike up this kind of immediately kind of awkward conversation. But this is where actually the descent into authenticity begins, or the ascent into authenticity, we should say. It's a good thing. Because Mitch asks about Stanley, he asked about Stanley and the way that he treats her. And Blanche moves on at the bottom and says, "You see, there's no privacy here. There's just these portieres between the two rooms," in her explanation. So she is, in her explanation of the problems between her and Stanley in the relationship, she deliberately brings up that sense of vulnerability. He stalks through the rooms in his underwear at night, and I ask him to close the bathroom door. That sort of commonness isn't necessary. So you can see, even in this moment where she's sort of descending into authenticity, she's still resting on these kind of performative crutches of socioeconomic class and a feigned sense of vulnerability. But there is this gradual admission of truths, I think, that takes place in this sort of monologue that she performs it. I mean, it's not technically a monologue, but it's so long that it feels like one. So she begins to be frank here because she talks about her salary. It's barely sufficient for her living expenses. I didn't save a penny last year, so I had to come in for the summer. That's why I have to put up with my sister's husband, and he has to put up with me. Apparently, so much against his wishes. Surely he must have told you how much he hates me. So she tries to get this kind of frank confession out of Mitch. He hates me, or why would he insult me? Of course, there is such a thing as the hostility of, perhaps in some kind of perverse way, to think of it makes me. She makes a gesture of revulsion. So here I think there is an awareness from her that there is some sort of sexual tension between her and Stanley, and she cannot articulate the sort of hostility of attraction with Stanley because it's, I think, there's a sense of self-loathing, I think, involved in her failure to understand that. She thinks that he may be attracted to her, but ultimately is sort of underconfident in that particular respect. But I think here is a genuine sort of, could be seen either as a genuine moment of revulsion towards the idea, or if you see her as having this kind of natural, innate sense of sexual magnetism towards Stanley, then as perhaps a dishonest performer. Now, I think, again, this little dialogue here shifts again from Mitch towards a moment of authenticity. Because he asks how old she is, and she makes a nervous gesture in response. So the fact here, again, is a shift towards honesty. And it's Mitch that ultimately provides this dynamic, I think, in their conversation, in their dialogue. Why do you want to know? I talked to my mother about you, and she said, how old is Blanche? And I wasn't able to tell her. And there's this pause that I think is a cause for optimism, and that's the thing. He makes clear here that he doesn't want knowledge of her in order to be dominant, in order to find cracks in her stories and her personality, and ultimately his accidental declaration that he has told his mother about her is what provides Blanche with the security, I think, to launch into a slightly more honest, authentic, confessional mode of conversation with him. I told my mother how nice you were and I liked you. Were you sincere about that? You know I was. And so the sincerity here, I think, is what actually deals with her actual anxiety here, and it gives us the impetus for what follows in the coming pages. Again, she says she's worried because I'm not settled. She wants me to be settled down before she. His voice is hoarse and he clears his throat, shuffling nervously around with his hands and out of his pocket. So the fact that what he's talking about, his mother wants him to settle down before she dies. But that's what he can't articulate. And then this body language in the stage direction shows us that fear of her dying, but also shows us that fear of his isolation, more importantly. And that's ultimately what he sees Blanche perhaps replacing, is that lost maternal. So again, there's that sense of these sort of Oedipal issues blighting and problematizing the possible attraction between two sort of consensual adults. Blanche here, I think, is talking honestly. She says, I think you have a great capacity for devotion. You'll be lonely when she passes on, won't you? And I understand what that is. And this is where we're talking now. This is where they both seem to be understanding each other. They're both drawn towards each other in their isolation and their vulnerability. She finally acknowledges one of the strengths of his personality and his character, and it is a capacity for devotion. He's an extremely kind and loyal individual. And so finally we've got a sense of connection established between the two of them, and that's what she says, I understand what it is to be lonely. And then this is what gives her, I think, the ultimate trust to tell him about, the truth about her past. I love someone too, and the person I loved, I lost. And then he just says, dead. She crosses to the window and sits on the sill looking out. She pours herself another drink. So here, there's this sense of her perhaps looking out in order to establish a sense of comfort to prepare for the confession that's going to follow, and she pours herself another drink. So again, it's not entirely her own sense of comfort with this story. She still needs alcohol to embrace reality in this fashion. But here, she talked honestly. He was a boy, just a boy, when I was a very young girl. When I was 16, I made the discovery, love, all at once and much, much too completely. It was like you suddenly turned a blinding light on something that had always been half in shadow. So the intensity of reality, I think, is too much for her when she talks about the past, and that's where this motif of the light comes from. That the light of reality that was turned on for her in this intense, powerful love that she experienced as a young girl, in any way, ultimately led to trauma, and that trauma is embodied in light itself. So this seeing the world as it really is ended up in trauma, and that's why she's so uncomfortable with light, and that's where the motif comes from. I was unlucky deluded. There was something different about the boy, a nervousness, a softness, a tenderness, which wasn't like a man's, although he wasn't the least bit effeminate looking. Still, that thing was there. He came to me for help, and so I didn't know that. The key thing here is that actually she realizes that her attraction to him was on the basis of some kind of vulnerability. But what she's obviously talking about is help in the context of her previous boyfriend, her previous husband's homosexuality. But that's what she was unaware of. She says, I didn't find anything out until after our marriage, and when we'd run away and come back, all I knew was I'd failed him in some mysterious way and wasn't able to give the help he needed but couldn't speak of. She's talking euphemistically about this sexuality, but again, you can see the way in which she blames herself that she's failed him in some mysterious way, and so that this light of reality that is represented by her intense passion towards this man, ultimately the tragedy that ensues is her fault in her own version. He was in the quicksands and clutching at me, but I wasn't holding him out. I was slipping in with him. So this sense of despair that her previous husband was experiencing through the trauma of repressed homosexuality was actually dragging her down into this fate of depression and dejection with him, but she wasn't aware of it. I didn't know anything except I loved him unendurably, but without being able to help him or help myself. Then I found out in the worst of all possible ways. Coming suddenly into a room that I thought was empty, which wasn't empty, but had two people in it. So there's this here, this moment of frank confession that she, this is important that she feels comfortable enough with Mitch to do this. But it's still too intense for her to endure it comfortably. If you look at the euphemistic language that she's using here, it shows us how much this disturbs her. And I think the fact that the locomotive is heard outside that causes her grief shows us this streetcar named Desire again. Actually, again, it's desire that brought her initial happy kind of relationship to a point of destruction, because it was, the fact that her husband desired a man ultimately that caused the trauma, and that her desire with these other soldiers is ultimately what's ruined her life. The headlight of the locomotive glares into the room as it thunders past, so again you get the sense of this light intensely penetrating their comfortable darkness. But again, the powerful force of reality and desire penetrating their situation here, and the irony of that is, of course, that their connection is not based on that intensive, passionate desire. It's based on a sense of shared vulnerability and suffering. Afterwards, we pretended that nothing had been discovered. Yes, the three of us drove out to Moon Lake Casino, very drunk and laughing all the way, and the polka music sounds in a minor key, faint with distance. This again explains the source of this trauma, that the polka music that was being played at the moment that he died is what she remembers and imagines as the source of the destruction of herself, and that here is what plays as she confronts this traumatic story in the past. The fact that it's in a minor key with faint distance, I think, shows us that sense of it not being resolved. The minor key feels tense and uncomfortable, but it's at distance at this moment in time. We dance the Vasuviana, which is the song that constantly plays and is the key to understanding her mental trauma. Suddenly, in the middle of the dance, the boy I'd married broke away from me and ran out of the casino. A few moments later, a shot. The polka stops abruptly. Obviously, that sound is obviously meant to mirror the story itself, where the music stops because the boy's killed himself. But there's a sense of cathartic confession here, and that at that moment in time, there's this brief sense of peace that has stopped the trauma because of the confession, but it quickly resumes again with her sense of guilt about this. You know, there's an honesty involved in the confession that stopped the trauma and stopped the music, but then it resumes as her awareness of her own guilt resumes. I ran out, all ran and gathered about the terrible thing at the edge of the lake. I couldn't get near for the crowding. And so this is where she talks about her guilt. He'd struck the revolver in his mouth and fired till the back of his head had been blown away. She sways and covers her face. There's a sense again of evading reality, but actually at the same time where she is confronting it. And then here, this is where she clearly articulates her own sense of guilt. I'd suddenly said, I know, you disgust me. And then the searchlight, which had been turned on the world, was turned off again. And never for one moment since has there been any light that's stronger than this kitchen candle. And so here, you know, this destruction of light, this destruction of the possibility of engaging with reality, with optimism, had been destroyed at that moment in time. And now she is unable to confront reality. And this explains where the leitmotif comes from in the way that it's associated with the horror of reality. Mitch gets up awkwardly and moves towards her a little, and the polka music increases, and I think the connection with the trauma shows this. But Mitch stands beside her, and I think he is here attempting to offer her a source of comfort, and draws her slowly into his arms. You need somebody, and I need somebody too. Could it be you and me, Blanche? And so there is here this possible sense of connection between the two of them. But we notice the contrast with that animalistic passion that Stanley and Stella share. But there is a glimpse of hope for both of them, who are both alienated and both at odds with reality. And the stage directions show this. Then with a soft cry, huddles in his embrace. And so there's this sort of movement towards him as a safe haven away from reality. She makes a sobbing effort to speak, but the words won't come. And this, I think, is important for Blanche because, again, like Pinter, there's a sort of authenticity in the fact that she can't speak. Her inarticulacy is a moment of authentic connection, an authentic representation of her feelings. He kisses her forehead and her eyes, finally her lips. The polka tune fades out. Her breath is drawn and released in long, grateful sobs. And Blanche just says, sometimes there's God so quickly. So this is a real moment, I think, of real beauty in the play, of two lost, unhappy souls finding some form of comfort and connection between the two of between each other and between themselves. You know, and it's not this kind of brutal animal passion that ultimately we see in the play. You know, this type of connection is completely overwhelmed and destroyed by that brutal animal passion. But this is what Williams, you sense there's a lot of heartfelt emotion being poured into this moment in the play. That it isn't ideal, but it is a solution. The polka tune fades out, so there is this sense of the trauma disappearing. Her breath is drawn and released in long, grateful sobs, so there's this sense of catharsis in the stage directions that show that she's gained at least some form of comfort that she's been looking for. And then, again, the structure of the play is all important here because this scene is immediately put alongside and juxtaposed with the moment where the full extent of her past is revealed. You know, she's revealed enough of it to feel a sense of comfort and a sense of authentic connection with another human being. But of course, she hasn't revealed all of the truth about her lascivious, salacious behaviour in Laurel with the soldiers. And it's important that Williams places alongside one another those two moments of optimism and then the beginning of her unraveling. You know, we have that immediate pessimistic suggestion of the tragic trajectory of her fate.